Hello and welcome everyone. We're just gonna give 10 seconds or so for everybody to connect, and we will kick off this webinar. Okay, let me start by introducing myself. My name is Stella Zarov. I'm a director at UI's Financial Services Consulting Practice and your moderator today. Thank you for joining this webinar called Frtb, Time to Address Implementation Challenges. Before I introduce the speakers, there are just a few housekeeping points I'd like to cover. Firstly, at the bottom of the webinar screen, you should be able to see a toolbar. You can use it to access a range of applications, such as the speaker's bios and additional resources. If you click on an application, it should open up on your screen, and all of the applications are resizable and movable, so you can get the most out of your screen space. Secondly, please submit your questions throughout the discussion today for the Q&A session, which we will hold at the end of the webinar. You can use the Q&A box on your screen to do so. And thirdly, your feedback is much appreciated, so please take a few minutes to complete the pop-up survey that will come up at the end of the session. And finally, just a note that the webinar today is held under Chatham House rules. Okay, with that out of the way, let me introduce the speakers that we have today, true powerhouses in the Frtb space. We have David Phillips, who is the head of traded risk measurement at Bank of England. We have Adolfo Montoro from Global Market Risk Analytics at Bank of America. Volker Wellman, Global Markets Frtb lead at BNP Paribas. And Fausto Marcella, head of Frtb and regulatory product management at Refinitiv. Welcome to all of our panelists, and thank you for participating today. Frtb has been one of the most hotly discussed topics across the industry for over 5 years or so now, as I'm sure most of you know. Taking stock of where we are compared to 5-6 years ago, we can admittedly see a bit of a Frtb fatigue with multiple delays, considerable implementation challenges, and a continued stream of areas of uncertainty around the rules. However, the clock for Frtb go live is ticking down, and working backwards from implementation date in 2023, the time to address these implementation challenges and open questions really is now. I'd like to start our discussion by asking our panelists, what are the main aspects of the Frtb regulation that still leave place to interpretation, if there are any? And maybe we can start with David. What is your view from a supervisor's perspective, and how would you expect banks to address the areas open for interpretation?
Thank you. Well, maybe I should start by just making that distinction between unintentional ambiguity that's sort of left in the rule versus flexibility that's sort of deliberately there. And the other thing to keep in mind is that obviously, whilst the Basel rules themselves have been finalised, all the major jurisdictions are still sort of working on their implementation of that. You know, and in the UK, for example, that will come via, you know, the onshore CRR2, probably some supervisory statements or something akin to, some regulatory technical standards, and on top of that, potentially some supervisory statements. So there's a, you know, it's very possible that further guidance or even rules will come as those rollouts sort of proceed. You know, regulation is a blend of legal requirements and expectations. So we're keen to get the balance right between what goes in that kind of higher level text, if you like, and what is implemented as an expectation. So I think that's the first point to note. You know, and in that context, sometimes regulators will want to wait, you know, for example, to consider a range of views before providing a formal statement on what it expects. So I think that's, you know, maybe I'll leave it to other panelists to comment on specific details, but I think that's the broader context here in terms of the way we see it.
Yeah, thank you, David. And then maybe Fausto, from Refinitiv's perspective as a data vendor, what are the open questions that you're facing at the moment?
Thanks, Stella. That's a great question. And from our perspective, actually, there are a few elements of the regulation that are still open to uncertainty. Think about, for example, the concept of non-negligible volume, which trades and quotes must have in order to be considered eligible for the RFET. Or think about the obligation that data vendors have of providing evidence of the transaction, or the obligation of being subject to an audit regarding the validity of the pricing information. But another interesting one, which I think it's worth discussing, is the definition of committed quotes. As we all know, the original BCBS text is defining a committed quote as a price coming from an arm's length provider at which the provider of the quote must buy or sell the financial instrument. So apparently in the definition of a committed quote, there is the possibility that either a bid or an ask might be there. However, if we see the work that Europe is doing, and in particular the draft RTS that has been published by the EBA in March 2020, basically we are seeing a different interpretation. Actually, they define a committed quote, to be verifiable, to be considered as a verifiable price. In order to be considered as a verifiable price, a committed quote from their perspective should have both a firm bid and a firm, ask price coming from the same provider, right? So clearly, this is quite a big difference from the original BCBS text, and there is actually a concern in the industry that this can actually, bring, to a significant decrease in terms of, eligible quotes for the RFET. And actually, this, I think that is a valid concern, because if you think that there are some certain bonds and derivative markets for which there is a request for quote trading protocol, right? So basically, those markets basically require either a bid or an ask price to be in place, not both. And even, if you think about the pre-trade transparency regime under MiFID II, basically there is no obligation for a quote to have both a firm, bid and ask price. So what is the consequence of this? There is uncertainty about this particular aspect, and consequently, many banks at the moment are actually, not assessing for their testing, not assessing modelability based on quotes. They are waiting for further clarification that, as David rightly say, will come, I believe, at local level, in local jurisdictions.
Yeah. Thank you, Fausto. And maybe we ask the same question from a bank's perspective. Volker, does what Fausto say resonate with you, and are you facing the same type of open questions, open interpretation questions?
There are some, yes. I mean, those directly on the how to obtain quotes, which ones are allowed, so to speak, is certainly an open question for us, and we need to see how that turns out, especially with respect to, as was mentioned, actual market practice, what's actually realistically available in a market. I would hope that there is an ongoing dialogue between supervisors and banks to work this out as we move closer to a full implementation. And another angle in this is also the aspect of how to map transaction to risk factors. We were initially quite concerned that this would become quite prescriptive. There were some attempts in the Basel text to define things like bucketing, or a full internal model approach where literally everything has to be proven. In practice, in banks, the information flows differently, and we have established processes for IPVs, for example, how price observations are linked to our own valuation models and risk models. And we would hope a lot of that existing infrastructure can be reused and maybe even, be improved and reinforced by this NMRF process. The EBA RTS that was referred to earlier, in its final version, seem to have allows, I think, for more of a principles-based approach in mapping transaction to risk factors, and also how to deal with things like parametric SMILE descriptions and generally bucketing of options and so on. So I think we are quite positive that we can find something there, and I think also supervisors, I think, are quite open to seeing the proposal and then responding. From the implementation side itself, though, there is certainly a challenge of actually putting all this data together and building an infrastructure that actually can handle all of these mappings. It's not just a simple spreadsheet table where you write product and risk factor next to each other. There are many more parameters that need to be handled flexibly. So, some banks are thinking of actually developing their own sort of language almost that can handle these mappings. We know there are some vendor solutions on the way potentially as well for handling this, but the management of these data flows is going to become a real challenge, not just the conceptual writing down of the mapping. And we also need to keep in mind, this will have to involve front office to quite a significant extent. This will not be a system or a process that runs purely on the risk side. The front office knows where liquidity is, where trades are observable, where quotes are observable, and their input is needed into these mappings, for example, and how things should be approached there. And this is, I think, culture-wise, probably quite a change to what exists currently, which will be a challenge for us as well.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, as it seems, the risk factor eligibility test seems to be the area, probably as expected by many people, the area that's still open to interpretation. Adolfo, is there anything else that you think is as an area that requires further clarification in the rules?
No, I think my colleagues already touched on a few of them, but I think one area for me it's not too much of clarification, but it's more like, and I think Volker hinted into it. It's like I see the FRTB. I think the effort the FRTB will require is really. It's not just to the build out of the model, which of course is a substantial part of it, but it's almost like how the business process about how all the various models are supposed to get to talk to each other, right? I mean, this is all the models need to be interconnected in a way, and each and every model, if you look at, for example, how the VAR needs to be connected with the expected shortfall, and how then the concept of observability of a risk factors connects with how you use that information in the context of back testing and the context of PLA. So I see there is I would say not much of an interpretation. I think it's the core of FRTB, right? I used to call it the interplay, right? The component of the FRTB. That again. It's because it requires again an overarching thinking of actually how do you want this machine to run on a day-to-day basis. I could see there a risk, not too much of a risk, but I could see that there could be various interpretation out there between firms, between jurisdictions, and potentially even between regulators. I mean, but I think it's I do see that that's what I see the major challenge of the FRTB in terms of like and particularly connected to the risk factor eligibility test. It's again how you combine all this model component and the business process around it, so that at the end of the day you have a story, right? You have a story that you could sell to. To internal stakeholders, meaning as Volker hinted, like, front office, you require partnership by them. So again, that process will be very clear, understood inside the bank. And then, of course, from a model developer point of view, you need to pass the approval of internal governance. You need to pass the approval of the validation, and ultimately, you need to also convince that such story it's also blessed by the regulator. So again, that's what I see the major. I think personally a major component is the business process, and the banks that are ahead of the game there. Understood the FRTB as a process. I think they might have a bit ahead of the game. I mean, the banks that they still thinking of FRTB like I just need to build a risk model. That's probably where I will see issues. Yeah.
Thank you for this. I think, as all of you rightly mentioned, the risk factor eligibility test as the most novel, complex, and, if I may say, exciting part of the rules is the one that poses the most challenges. Hence, our second section of the discussion today will be specifically focused on that, to talk about what what specific challenges we all of us face. But before we start discussing, maybe we should ask the audience this question: what do you see as the main challenges in the implementation of the risk factor eligibility test? I'm gonna pop a poll question on the screen. Let's see if this works. Hopefully it works. Yep. So please select as many answers as you think relevant for this questions. And while we wait for the results to come in, maybe we can ask Fausto from a data vendor perspective, what are the main risk factor eligibility challenges you face, given that banks will be looking to you for potential data solutions?
Thanks for the question, Stella. And actually, there is no doubt that the RFET is a big adage for the industry today. And this is mainly because banks do not have sufficient internal trading activity, sufficient number of trades and quotes across asset classes for passing the test. They need to source trades and quotes specifically in illiquid markets outside, which means sourcing data from external vendors, sourcing data from alternative sources, and so on. But this is coming with several challenges, and perhaps the most relevant ones could be three. The first one is about the fact that many markets do not have sufficient transparency, and so it is difficult to get access to valid trades and quotes out of them. So the initiative that we have seen recently, for example, about MiFID for giving transparency to some of the OTC markets is definitely a good step ahead, but it's not enough. There is still work that has to be done for giving much transparency to several markets. The second challenge, in my view, is about the complex, data management effort that banks have to undertake, for managing this test. So they have to source, again, a huge amount of data across many different sources, and this would require data management infrastructures in place. They have to have complex mapping rules, for consolidating data coming from different sources with different formats, and making them basically, available in a consistent data model. So these are all challenges that, to be honest, are quite huge to be overcome. And finally, I would also mention the fact that market risk people, specifically during the testing that they are actually doing, in 2021 and potentially in 2022 as well, they need to have access, quickly and rapidly to alternative sources, to sources of data, and test, quite quickly this data, including the data coming from vendors, to make sure that they can apply the necessary refinements to the mapping rules of instruments to risk factors. So these are all challenges that are real, and in my view, data vendors can play a role for helping banks to to address all these challenges. First of all, what they can do is basically to make things easier to access the data and consume their data. So, for example, the usage of APIs for providing access to the data, the usage of cloud-based technologies, the usage of data models based on industry standard. These are all good things that can definitely go into that direction. Also, I think that specifically in this particular period of our life, on which we have been all impacted by this COVID-19 problem, and in particular, banks are overwhelmed. From so many, priorities, and sometimes conflicting priorities. They don't have the time, and they don't have, in many cases, the resources for basically testing, and building, software for testing the data coming from data vendors. So I believe that one of the things that data vendors can do in this space is to invest in tools, that will help banks to quickly test their data, the data that are coming from data vendors, without investing, money in building software. So tools that can have, for example, graphical user interface that can allow features for implementing, instruments to risk factor mappings, these kind of things that, can help the life of market risk people. And we definitely have invested a lot of time and resources on this particular aspect. And finally, I think that, a last thing that data vendors can do is basically, keep engaging with the industry, keep engaging with the regulators to make sure that the rules and the local interpretation of the rules are shaped in the right way. So I think that the role of data vendors is to make sure that they show up to the relevant jurisdiction, regulators into the relevant jurisdiction, what is the impact of a certain decision about certain aspects of the rules? For example, we discussed about the committed quotes. So what is the impact of going to a direction instead of another, right? And basically propose alternatives. These are all good things that I believe that vendors can do to help banks.
Thank you, Fausto. Let's see what the audience has said about the main challenges. Yeah. So I think that very well reflects what we've discussed so far. The main challenges are mapping risk factors to instruments. Top one challenge that our audience have selected, followed by sourcing the right transaction committed quotes data. So this relates to what you were saying, Fausto. And then thirdly, the operationalization of the test, traceability, audit traceability, ownership, as well as design of the test. All of the points that we've touched on so far. And certainly we as a consulting firm are seeing that the risk factor eligibility test is definitely one of the most challenging, and our clients, the banks, are pushing back the implementation of the test compared to perhaps other areas of the rules for various reasons. So maybe we can ask Adolfo whether he thinks that the challenges selected by the audience are truly the biggest ones, and whether they're the reason that banks are somewhat reluctant to jump into risk factor eligibility implementation straight away.
No, I think actually the outcome, I'm totally fully aligned with the outcome of the poll, because I think ultimately, if you look at all the components of the FRTB, right? I mean, obviously there are many components, but in terms of if you look at expected shortfall, right? I mean, it's like the step to go from VAR to expected shortfall, like from an ownership point of view, from a system point of view, is not that huge, right? So no big nuance there. Yes, a bit of calculation complexity the FRTB will introduce with the cascade approach and the likes. P&L attribution, again, extreme challenging, but still not a massive new concept. But when you look at the risk factor eligibility test, I think which from day one, when I actually saw the first paper of the FRTB being published in 2012, oh my gosh, it was clear to me that was really the component that would have moved the needle of FRTB, and that to me it was I heard the message loud and clear by reading the RFED test, that again the regulators are asking for a shift in the way we control and the data that flows into the model. So essentially, no good data, no good model. So, and with the RFED test, I think this is clearly a way, an attempt, or hopefully a good attempt, to target this traceability of control of the risk factor definition, control of the data that forms a time series, validation of every data point of a time series, and eventually link it to the market observable. So I like the word traceability. Eventually, the ultimate test that you can say that you can prove that time series is good is if you actually tie that time series to a set of observable. So I think I'm not surprised that for example the 42.3 or 57.7% on the two answer, because the reason why it's taking a while to take off is obviously banks always need time to consume this information. Again, it hasn't been easy because of the many different things out there. But most important, I think it's also a matter of ownership. Not really clear whether the process should sit into one department or whether it should be sitting across multiple departments. And when this is the case, you have to have a clean business process, a clear kind of key operating procedure on, again, who is meant to, which data you're going to use for, internal, external, how is this data validated daily, and how you link this data to the market, what feedback loop mechanisms you apply to this data. So these, again, are all concepts that, depending on the banks you're looking at least the experience that I manage at the bank that I happen to work with, or that I happen to be close with in terms of understanding their business setup, for certain banks, looking at RFED, It's again, I think Volker hinted to it. You could say when you look at the requirements of RFED, they're not too much dissimilar from the requirements on prudent valuation, right? So again, even there, you have to have a completeness risk factors definition, show completeness of risk factors, and ensure that you can verify this observable or set of market data parameter or model parameter you can trace it back to an observable. So again, I think other banks, this concept are pretty much detached, and maybe they were quickly to realize the synergies and they move on. Other banks, they're still kind of assessing, and maybe they're spending too much time into the assessment. They're kind of missing the big picture of. But I think, for me, I think that's the main reason why RFED has probably been left a bit, as taken time to take off as a topic. But I think it does require, I would say, an overview or re-engineering, although I hate this word, a re-engineering of a data strategy, and to Fausto's point, how when I talk about data strategy, I also refer, how you complement the data how able are you to reuse the data that the banks already have, which we have tons of data. So how do we reuse that data? And if that data is not enough, what are the gaps, and at which time we need to reach out to vendors and need to work out with vendors. So these are topics that, again, mainly because they touch at the heart of how the banks operate today, and with multiple players in certain cases, it takes time, right, to get this conversation nailed down, right? So.
Yeah, and Volker, do you share the same concerns as Adolfo? And have you faced similar challenges around ownership and synergies within the bank and implementing the respect eligibility?
Yes, and other elements of FRTB as well, as Adolfo said. The thing is, this is a long project. FRTB fatigue was mentioned before. I think it will be with us for a few more years to come. And we need to make sure that whatever we do for FRTB is somehow efficient and does link up with the rest of our businesses. Yeah. So in our program, we're constantly looking at what are we building now. How much of it can be used immediately? How much has a direct impact on our processes, be it risk management, be it modeling that we're already doing, and gain those synergy from that. And it is true that certain aspects, and in some way collecting data for RFET tests is more challenging, because you could simply say, look, we don't need it today. We need it to test the pipes and get some guidance on mappings and so on the operational model potentially. But we don't have to spend every single day looking for quotes and trades. Yeah, this will be at some point ahead of us in the future. So retaining that energy of actually, keeping going, collecting it, maintaining it is actually very hard. And other aspects like P&L attribution, I think, have a more direct benefit. Again, even that is hard work, but it's easier to convince people internally that there is a benefit already.
Yeah. Thank you for this. Okay, so moving on to the next topic in our discussion. I mean, we've all been working on FRTB for quite a while now, as transpired. I mean, to 2012 for some people. But while we work to tackle FRTB, the world is obviously moving on and changing, with a number of other initiatives in place, such as the IBOR transition, and of course the COVID crisis that hit us last year, which not only derailed the FRTB implementation efforts and timeline, but also proved to be a true test of the performance of FRTB under stress. So maybe we start with David. What lessons did we learn about the behavior of FRTB during the COVID crisis, and how is it going to affect the FRTB implementation?
Thanks. Maybe let me start by answering a slightly different question, which is, what did we learn about how the existing model framework worked? And I think that was interesting. As many of you will recall, the current market risk framework was developed in response largely to the previous financial crisis. The imposition of stress measures and various other changes. So it was kind of interesting to see how a framework that was built largely to increase capital requirements quite rapidly kind of behaved during a stress period. And by and large, I think the feeling is it sort of held up sort of reasonably well. There were some concerns around the edges of that, and so, for example, a number of regulators took steps to prevent capital increases in March and April from the increased number of backtesting exceptions that many firms' models experienced as the market volatility sort of increased rapidly. So that's, I think, something that carries across to FRTB, and regulators will, no doubt want to pay close attention to those sorts of concerns, but both that example and others that may mean the framework is sort of judged to be sort of perhaps a little bit too pro-cyclical. I think we did sort of kind of spoken to a few sort of data vendors, and actually I think the market liquidity in relation to the RFET test, for example, held up perhaps better than some may have expected, but it's perhaps too early to conclude on that. I think one other point looking ahead to FRTB perhaps is that what we did see is that the stress VaR measures were noticeably more stable than the VaR measures. Now, of course, that shouldn't be a complete surprise, but of course, FRTB is based on a single stressed measure and doesn't have a current period measure in the way that the current framework does. So I think that's another sort of positive. But in terms of, I think they're probably the key takeaways at this stage. But I mean, I wouldn't say a complete post-mortem in terms of COVID has been completed yet. So there may well yet still be some further issues to sort of think through as we progress further through the FRTB implementation.
Thank you. And when it comes to the IBOR transition, Fausto, do you see any challenges coming in play related to the FRTB implementation?
Yeah, just to add, another element of complexity here to, this very complex scenario. So the thing here is that FRTB is going to be implemented, across a big structural change, which is driven by this LIBOR transition. Just a couple of weeks ago, the Financial Conduct Authority actually announced that the LIBOR will be ceased by the end of 2021. So what's going to happen now that can impact FRTB is that we will see a decrease in liquidity in LIBOR-based, floating rate notes or derivatives, right? And we will start progressively to see an increase in liquidity in contracts that are based on risk-free rates, right? Clearly, on this last point, there might be countries that are well developed in terms of getting already good liquidity on risk-free rates transactions, and one of them for sure is UK with Sonia, which is there, has been there since time. But there are other jurisdictions. I'm thinking about Europe in particular, and the US, on which Ester and SOFR are still, do not have enough liquidity yet. So the problem here is that during the transition period of this LIBOR transition, you can have risk factors, that are LIBOR-based that, over time will become non-modelable. And at the same time, you will see, these risk-free rate-based risk factors that, will also are non-modelable because there is not enough liquidity. So how this problem can be actually addressed? So I think that the clarification that the BCBS provided last year in the FAQ published on, if I remember well, on June 2020, basically can help, because they are saying in that text, in that document, they are saying that now banks are allowed to use observations coming from the old benchmark, as well as observations coming from the new corresponding benchmarks for a period of time corresponding to 1 year since the cessation of the old benchmark, which is good. So this can help to address the challenge. But I also think that the timeline, the enforcement timeline for FRTB, as we know, the earliest time for implementing FRTB is 2023, but we already know that in some jurisdictions like Europe, this will be much later. So we are talking in Europe about 2024 or 2025. Anyway, the timeline can help because during this period, which is from now to the implementation of FRTB, this clearly the liquidity for risk-free rate-based contracts will grow, and consequently, these factors that today we risk to be not modelable, will become modelable, later.
Yeah, thank you, Fausto. So, I mean, from my perspective, it seems that both the COVID crisis and the LIBOR transition have one thing in common. They reinforce the importance of high quality data. So, Volker, do you think that banks are up for this challenge?
We're always up for a challenge. Yeah, data is definitely the core element in all this. And what's very clear, and I think anyone who's working on FRTBs can see this, the sheer volume of data created by this framework is very significant in terms of what is needed as input data. We're talking about RFET tests, for example, historic data for the calibration of the stressed window, all sorts of aspects, plus what the model actually produces. All the various measurements for the L test, the various gas liquidity horizons, the default timings for under the DRC, will create a huge amount of data to be analyzed as well. It's not just going into a model and then giving a capital output number, but it needs to be understood by many people along those chains. And as we, I think, also probably know, a lot of things in those chains can go wrong. There can be a pricing error. There can just be an outage of one system not producing a file overnight. There can be a static data issue. A new ISIN hasn't been set up. I think we're all familiar with these little niggles that can potentially multiply in such a complex system. And we saw during the crisis last year, also with respect to the backtesting exceptions, that sometimes when you get to these points where something goes over the boundary, a lot of analysis is needed to actually verify, is this real? Yeah, is our model defective? Is our data defective? Is it just a file missing? The normal approach is you receive a top-level number which isn't in line with expectation, and you have to drill down what's the root cause of it. And in most of these cases, you need a lot of experts from different teams to look at this. This needs human intervention still. And the challenges will be there on that, getting the people together along the chains to be ready to analyze, give their input, make the correction and fixes. Plus, the challenge will be, which I really see mounting, that all this has a very small time window only. You cannot look at your NMRF or your PLA result a week or a month later. Because new data is coming in at the same time, your pipe is constantly being filled up. So you need to be very quick in your turnaround times to respond to any challenges. And when we saw how we put together teams to look at backtesting and VAR evolution over March and April last year, yeah, it will keep you awake overnight. And if you think of this literally happening every single day, that for me would be a real challenge for banks to be setting up in their operating model to deal with this. We see a small scale of this already, and in a way it's quite good to get the dry run through the SA reporting. In Europe we will have to start reporting the standard approach calculations later this year. So gearing up for this and ensuring good data quality for the SA, and industry has helped as well by looking at benchmarking and doing test portfolio trades and so on. It is quite challenging, even on something that should be as simple as a standard approach. So I think we're getting a small flavor of what there is to come with a factor of 5 to 10 added to it.
Thanks, Volker. Adolfo, do you share the same lessons learned, and do you think the FRTB models will be able to withstand a future COVID crisis?
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, the short answer is yes. I mean, obviously, again, I think for me, and Volker hinted into it, I think the key challenge is once you implemented this machine, I mean, how you at the end of the day, you make sure that the number produced is of use to the bank as well. I mean, that the bank is reacting to it, and what is the feedback loop. And so you need to not only build the machine, but you need to drill down functionalities so that very quickly you realize what's going on and what signal the model is, or the various model components are giving to the model developer, to the bank, because you need to react, right? You need to react because there is a grace period allowed in the PLA. There is a grace period allowed in the RFED, but you need to react, right? So you need to know this, on the day. I think in terms of the other challenges that I probably I could have touched on earlier on, I think it's and I have experienced this also even directly. I think whenever people think about FRTB and RFED, they immediately kind of trying to use the parallel of today's world of sourcing time series for SFAR, going back to 2007, building filling algorithm and the likes, which is all good, of course, not diminishing the importance of that. But I think sometimes we forget that under FRTB, the regulators have understood, right, that there is sometimes there is no data, right? So sometimes you have to, and the whole mechanism of the expected shortfall with the stress, reduced set of risk factors, and the full current, reduced current. I mean, so also at least to put together to, in a way, circumnavigate the challenge of necessarily going back and feed data from 2007. If there's no data, there is no data. But rather, I think the essence is really, and that's what I think Volker hinted at the beginning, it's like whenever we build these processes, of course, eventually we could stretch them back, going back to 2007, but it's kind of pointless at this stage. I think it's more like, how have you set up your infrastructure, if you set up the business process so that going forward you are able to do that. So I think it's, but I think COVID gave us certainly some lesson from an internal model point of view, some feedback, strong feedback also. It was a good benchmark for FRTB. I mean, is there anything that we should have changed, or that should be changed, or should be readapted? Yeah, I have few views there, and maybe, but I will probably leave it for the next question. or if the audience is able to pick up on that, I will probably answer that towards the end. I'm conscious of the time.
Yes, thank you, Adolfo. Yeah, let's move on to the last section of our webinar, and then we can maybe discuss this further in the Q&A session. So as we see, there are a number of areas in the rules open for interpretation, with each local regulator expected to elaborate to various degrees, and this will lead to inevitable local divergences of the FRTB rules on top of the already possible divergences in the implementation timelines across the various jurisdictions. So how could this be addressed by banks? And maybe we'll start with David with a commentary here around how he sees the jurisdictional differences. I think we might have lost David. Yeah. I think he might have some technical difficulties. So then maybe the same question to Fausto. What implications are you seeing when trying to come up with data solutions for your global clients with all the anticipated jurisdictional differences?
Thanks for the question. I believe that differences will be inevitable. So we will have differences in the local interpretation of the rules, and we are already seeing this happening. So, as I said before, for the committed quotes, we are seeing a different interpretation from the BCBS text, or at least some much more detail, which apparently contradicted the BCBS text, taken by the European Commission, and I'm sure that we will see more. From my personal perspective, I believe that the more local differences, local divergences we will have on the global regulation, the more this will cause some increase in terms of costs for adopting and for passing the RFET. I'll give an example, right? So let's take, for example, the committed quote definition. Let's assume that this may be different across few jurisdictions. So this would imply that a data vendor should have a kind of custom, let's say, solution of their services for basically serving the European jurisdiction and serving all the others if they decide to adopt different definitions of committed quotes, right? And the same will be, for example, for another concept, which is still not fully defined by the regulation, which is about the auditing of the data vendor solutions with regard to the validity of their pricing information, right? So this was something that was introduced by the BCBS text in the final version. However, in that text there is not sufficient detail for moving to implementation. And what happened is that we are seeing now some level of detail from the RTS that was published in Europe by the EBA last year, on which there is, I would say, much more clarity about what is the scope of this auditing and basically how this auditing should be conducted. So again, if other jurisdiction will implement this in a different way, will clarify, will interpret this in a different way. So again, this would imply that the vendors should have different custom version of the solution with regard to this aspect as well. So the final result, the final outcome of this is all these local differences can basically imply a cost from a data vendor perspective, that at the end, will be a cost for the overall industry for basically, passing this RFET.
Yeah, thank you, Fausto. I think we have David back online. So, David, what is your view on the inevitable jurisdictional differences that are going to arise with FRTB?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I just would sort of, bring in some sort of context that some degree of difference is inevitable. People, the fact that the Basel rules are relatively high level in many respects, as has been kind of touched on already, and the fact that the legal process for rulemaking is somewhat different in the different key jurisdictions means that inevitably some differences will kind of crop up. That said, and also there's a difference in approach, I think, that we've seen historically between, let's say, the US, which is a bit more principle-based, versus the EU, and indeed the UK prior to the adoption of the CRR was somewhat more principles-based in the old BIPRU. That said, I don't think that necessarily precludes a single implementation for a global firm, but it does make that more of a challenge. So it is possible often to find a single kind of implementation that can meet the different requirements. But in the UK, I think we're mindful of the challenges that can lead to. We do take compliance with the Basel standards very seriously, so as do others. So I don't think there's any intentional or any intention to sort of materially diverge from those. But what I would sort of recommend is that where banks have, or indeed data vendors have significant concerns, that it's best to engage early with the relevant regulators on that, to try and get a steer as to whether their intended approach is are likely to be acceptable or not. That I think is perhaps the best way to deal with these sorts of differences when they crop up. But there is, that said, there's a degree of cooperation between regulators over and above sort of the Basel process itself, and so we are talking. The PRA, for example, it does talk to the ECB and the Fed, for example, and we'll continue to do so to each understand what the other is sort of thinking on topics. So I think that maybe surprisingly, regulators as much as banks would be keen to have consistency in the rules, but we're not uniquely able to achieve that.
Yeah, thanks, David. I think that's a good statement there at the end. So, Adolfo, working in a globally active bank, then are you approaching FRTB as a global FRTB implementation despite the regional differences?
No, I think it's I will link to what David was saying. I see. I think obviously we will wish for one solution fit them all, but I think again we are kind of also preparing for maybe that not to be the case. I think I think what will be important is to ensure that the building block will be one. I will doubtfully suspect that as David mentioned, that any jurisdiction will materially diverge from Basel, but I would expect for the building blocks really to be one. And then of course I will try and bake in such potential different configurability of the framework in the build out. I think in the sense of almost I see, because of the nuances of the text and because perhaps different regulators might interpret the text slightly different, I see actually this as a positive, and to David's point, I see this as a positive in the sense that these different views might actually kind of stimulate the right conversation in the bank, right? In terms of like considering other dimensions that and not be considered in the past. As I said, I've mentioned, I mentioned the possibility of cooperating or streamlining a bit more the processes of valuation for proven valuation and an MRF. So that not necessarily the processes are identical, but again, there are areas of synergies that could be exploited. If a regulator is actually going to confirm and say, well, actually, I don't need to do this, but that's fine. But still, I think they will be valuable. I think at the end of the day, I think it's not too much for me about the again. I'm pro consistency and one solution, but I do expect that that's not going to be exactly the case. But I do think that it's a challenge that we will generate the right level of discussion in the bank, and I think it will help also again with an early engagement with the regulators. I think it will pan out new solutions that have not been thought through, even in the industry and even by engaging with the vendors. You could see that even in the discussion with the vendors and with Refinitiv, you could see that again the discussion has evolved from when we started like a few years ago now, right? I mean, we're just talking different things, and so I think that's the way to go. I mean, it's that's a challenge, I say. So I will see it as a positive thing to think and multiple configuration. Yeah.
Yeah. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you for this informative discussion. I think we can now move on to the Q&A session part of this webinar. Just a reminder to the audience that you can submit your questions via the Q&A box and the toolbar in your webinar screen. And while we will give you a couple of minutes to think about any questions, I'm going to put another poll on the screen that talks about the implementation timeline for IMA. I think that's given the context of a certain uncertainty, challenges, and potential divergences. I think it's an important question to see how banks are planning or when banks are planning to implement their IMA models. So I'll give you a couple of minutes to think about questions and answer the poll, and then we'll move on to the Q&A. Okay, I think we have some questions have come in. Let me put the results of the poll to the screen. I think they're more or less expected. The majority with IMA implementation timeline end of 2022, just in time for the 2023 Frtb go live. And interestingly, some people are planning to go beyond 2024. Okay, so let's move on to some of the audience questions that we have submitted. Let's see. So question number 1. Sorry, let me just scroll through. Is there still a business model using Frtb IMA for Pillar 1? And maybe Volker can try and answer this question.
Yeah, I understand the question as meaning, is there still a case of working on an IMA model when the standard approach has also been improved? And obviously, the IMA comes with all the challenges we've just discussed. It's a tough question, and it's some that we've certainly asked internally. We've been asked externally as well. What are your plans? What are your own intentions? And it certainly brings it up because let's keep in mind as well that under Frtb, you can apply for the internal model on a desk-by-desk basis. Yeah, so you can actually look at your businesses and see which ones of those do you want to apply the internal model for. I'm in general in favor of internal models. It has a benefit for internal risk management. There should be, for me, as much alignment as possible. we are, quite a good, user of our current internal model across all levels of management and front office risk and so on. So having a good internal model, and I think by large the FRTB internal model is a good improvement of the current internal model, has a benefit. The risk is that the implementation and the actual running of it might just take over and just consume all of us. So just the effort of producing a number becomes more important than the number itself, and that will become very dangerous. So we have to see how that turns out, and I think this will be the process of the next few years when we actually start producing, reporting the numbers, analyzing them, discussing with supervisors how we're going to use them, what they mean for us, which cliff edges might we experience once we want to go into an internal model. Because keep in mind as well, compared to the current one, you are never fully approved for your internal model. Your internal model approval is still always conditional on a whole lot of tests that can disappear at any point in time, which obviously, again, makes the business case more challenging. Do you want to invest in something that you have no guarantee you'll be able to use next year and the year after? So it's something we need to consider. And I would say there are probably businesses, especially those that are not very complex, that might not benefit from an internal model because their activity is on limited set of risk factors with very, very easy risk profiles, quite linear, limited number of products. And for operational reasons, standard approach might be the better choice for them. But I think these will probably be discussions over the next few years with supervisors as this all becomes clearer.
Thank you, Volker. Okay, let's move on to another question. We have a question around the PLA test, which I think is different, something we haven't necessarily touched upon. What about the source of the data for the PLA test? Is it risk or front office? The debate still goes on, or do we have a formal answer from the supervisor? Maybe we can ask David if we have a formal answer.
I'm slightly surprised with the question in that, as I understand, the choice is for the firm to make. The provision to use the front office data in the context of that test was a concession, actually, to allow that test, I was going to say to make that test easier to pass. That's not quite why it was conceded. I think there was merit. It was considered there was merit in aligning the data in making that test, recognizing it was largely supposed to be a test about a test that firms have incorporated the right risk factors, rather than being driven by minor differences in data timing or data sources. So I think the choice is on the firm side as to whether they feel they need to align that data in order to pass that test. Most of what we hear is that firms do think they do need to.
Yeah, Adolfo, from your perspective, how are you aligning the data?
I think it's the idea is, I think it's more like to echo David, what David said. I think I mean, you need to align. I think the alignment is not coming for free. I mean, in order to align, I mean, you need to build again a data strategy that will enable to align basically in the first place. So I think there are cases where again the alignment it might be already there because a bank has a data strategy end to end. And so basically the alignment comes almost for free, but that will come at a certain cost. There are other cases where, again, you need to kind of almost force the alignment and then, prove those conditions. But yeah, I would echo David. I think it's, the alignment came as a concession in the latest consultation. But I think it's still up for the conversation, like whether we fully align, whether we partially align, or whether we kind of mix and match data depending on the cases.
Okay, Thanks, Adolfo. I appreciate we're a bit behind, but given that we started a bit later, I'm going to give another couple of questions from the audience. So we have a question around IMA banks. So do current IMA banks under Basel 2.5 intending not to pursue IMA under FRTB require some formal dispensation or approval from their regulator? I think it's a good question to ask to David.
Yeah, I think the idea is, in general, no. Excuse me, no. But I'd certainly encourage any bank considering that taking that course of action to kind of liaise closely with their own sort of regulator as to what their expectations are. But unless you're otherwise sort of told so, any permission under existing rules will not be internal model permission would not be grandfathered under FRTB rules. So an FRTB IMA permission will require, a separate permission. They're quite different frameworks. So I think that, that generally speaking ought to be how it works. But as I say, be well advised to talk to your regulator to get their sort of feedback.
Yep. Okay. Thank you. Okay, maybe one last question. We're running out of time. Maybe a quick question for Fausto, because it's related to something that he mentioned earlier. You did mention the non-eligible volume requirement for valid RPOs as part of the uncertain aspects of the rules. Can you elaborate a bit more about that?
Okay, thanks. That's another great question. Conscious of time, a very quick answer. So basically, I believe that putting some volume-based limits, is something very difficult. First of all, at industry level, because for many markets from banks, that banks typically will use for sourcing real RPOs, real price observation. Many markets do not have sufficient transparency, right, for calibrating this framework. So it will be difficult, to perform this kind of calibration in markets that do not provide, access to trades, or at least do not provide enough access to trades. So those markets that are not transparent. And I see this also difficult, to calibrate such a threshold of the volume at firm level, as in liquid markets, right? The provision of volume information from, coming from third party trades or quotes, actually can impact negatively, the provision of liquidity, because it's quite, a kind of sensitive information. So I think that this is at the end, this would be something that we have to see how this will be calibrated, if it will be calibrated. But I see this quite, a difficult task.
Okay, thanks a lot, Fausto. Given that we're running out of time, I think it's time to wrap up. Appreciate that there are quite a few questions still unanswered in the Q&A box. But if you put these questions in the feedback survey that will appear shortly on the screen, we can try and get back to you separately with answers to those questions. Okay, perfect. So I'd like to thank you very much to the panelists for the lively discussions that we had here today. Hope it was useful to everybody. I would also like to thank the organizers of this webinar behind the scenes, Sarah and Anastasia, who made this whole webinar happen. And then finally, thank you for all the participants for attending this. I hope you found it interesting and valuable. Please don't forget to fill in the feedback form, which will appear shortly on the screen, and have a good rest of the week, and best of luck tackling the challenges of FRTB. Thank you so much.
Thank you.